The town of Clearwater was a forgotten speck on the map, surrounded by endless fields and dense woods. For years, its residents had begged the county for a doctor. The nearest hospital was over an hour away, and many lives had been lost during emergencies. Clearwater's lifeline was its close-knit community. They took care of each other as best they could. But there were limits to what they could do without proper medical care. One gray morning, their prayers seemed to be answered. A man arrived in town driving a sleek black car that contrasted starkly against the muddy roads. He was tall and pale, dressed in an impeccably tailored black coat, and carried a medical bag made of worn leather. His hair was silver, though he appeared no older than 40, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to study everyone he met as if he could see straight through their skin. He introduced himself as Dr. Elias Dane, a traveling physician seeking a new place to settle. His voice was smooth and calm, the kind that soothed people even as it commanded their attention. "I have heard this town is in need," he said to the gathering of curious townsfolk outside the general store. "Allow me to help." The mayor, Henry Briggs, stepped forward, visibly relieved. "We've been desperate for someone like you, doctor. Folks here need care badly." Dr. Dunne smiled faintly. "I offer my services to all, free of charge. My methods may be unorthodox, but I assure you, they are effective." The townsfolk whispered among themselves. A free doctor? It sounded too good to be true, but desperation has a way of blinding people to potential danger. They welcomed him, showed him to an old boarding house near the church, and helped him set up a clinic in the former hardware store. The first patient came that very evening. Molly Keene, a widow in her 60s, had been bedridden for months due to a mysterious ailment that no one could diagnose. Her son, Daniel, carried her into the clinic on a makeshift stretcher. Dr. Dane examined her with meticulous care, his gloved hands moving deftly over her frail body. "It's an imbalance," he announced finally. "A rare condition, but one I can treat." He opened his bag and removed a vial of dark liquid, drawing a syringe full of the strange substance. Molly protested weakly, but her son reassured her. "Just give it a shot, Ma. What do we have to lose?" Dr. Dane administered the injection, and within minutes, Molly was sitting up in bed, her color returning. By the next morning, she was walking, laughing, and even cooking breakfast for her astonished son. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, people were lining up outside the clinic. Arthritis, fevers, chronic pain, Dr. Dane seemed capable of curing anything. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, and never asked for payment. But not everyone was convinced. Pastor Charles Grayson, the town's moral compass, watched Dr. Dane with growing suspicion. "There's something unnatural about that man," he told his wife Abigail one night after dinner. "No one can perform miracles like that without consequences." Abigail frowned. "You're always wary of outsiders. He's helped so many people already. Shouldn't you be grateful?" "Perhaps," Charles admitted, though uneasily. "But I've seen his kind before. Men who promise salvation, only to leave ruin in their wake." His unease deepened when Molly Keene disappeared. A week after her miraculous recovery, Daniel found her bed empty and no sign of where she had gone. He searched the house, the surrounding fields, even the woods, but she was nowhere to be found. Other townsfolk helped in the search, but it was as if Molly had vanished into thin air. When questioned, Dr. Dane expressed mild concern but claimed ignorance. "I'm a doctor, not a keeper of records," he said smoothly. Perhaps she decided to visit relatives. People sometimes make surprising choices after a new lease on life. Daniel didn't buy it, but the rest of the town seemed satisfied with the explanation. After all, how could they accuse the man who had brought her back from the brink of death? Molly's disappearance was soon overshadowed by new cases. Each week, Dr. Dane cured another supposedly incurable condition. Ella Robbins' rheumatoid arthritis, Walter Hensley's failing eyesight, young Daisy Miller's severe asthma. One by one, Clearwater's sick and suffering were healed. And then, one by one, they disappeared. Ella's son found her house empty one morning, her knitting still sitting on the armrest of her chair. Walter's glasses were left on his nightstand, his bed untouched. Daisy's parents woke to find her room vacant. the window ajar despite the winter chill. At first, people tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Maybe they had moved away, seeking a new start elsewhere. But the pattern was undeniable, and Pastor Grayson began to speak out more boldly. "We must confront him," he urged the mayor during a town meeting. "This man has brought us miracles, yes, but at what cost? He comes into our town, performs impossible feats, and our loved ones vanish. This is no coincidence. He is not what he seems." The mayor hesitated. Like most of the townsfolk, Henry Briggs had seen his fair share of tragedy. His wife had died of cancer 2 years ago, and he often wondered if Dr. Dane's arrival had come just a little too late. "We can't accuse a man without proof," he said finally. "And I won't have this town tearing itself apart over rumors." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Then I'll find the proof myself." Late one night, Pastor Grayson approached the clinic. He had waited until the lights were out, the streets silent. A cold wind whipped through the empty town square as he crept around to the back of the building. He carried a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and determination. He pried open a window and climbed inside. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else he couldn't place, something metallic and acrid. He moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The examination room looked normal enough, but as he pushed deeper into the building, he found a locked door at the end of the hall. Grayson wedged the crowbar into the frame and forced the door open. Beyond it was a staircase leading down into the basement. The metallic smell grew stronger as he descended, his footsteps echoing on the stone steps. At the bottom, he found something that made his blood run cold. The basement was nothing like the pristine clinic upstairs. The air was damp and oppressive, carrying the distinct metallic tang of blood. Pastor Grayson's flashlight revealed a room filled with strange equipment, glass jars filled with murky liquid, surgical tools that looked more like instruments of torture, and shelves lined with books bound in cracked leather. Their spines bore titles and languages he didn't recognize, their faded lettering hinting at arcane knowledge. But it wasn't the equipment that made him recoil. It was the table in the center of the room. A long, stainless steel table stood under a flickering bulb, its surface stained with dark patches. On it lay a limp figure, a young woman. Her skin was unnaturally pale, her chest unervingly still. Grayson's heart raced as he recognized her. Daisy Miller, the teenager who had disappeared just days earlier. But something was wrong. Her features were slack, lifeless, as if she were a wax figure rather than a living, breathing person. "What in God's name?" he whispered. Grayson stepped closer, his shaking hand reaching out to touch her. Before he could, a faint whisper filled the room. It wasn't coming from Daisy. It was coming from everywhere. The sound was like dry leaves scraping across stone. A collective murmur of voices too faint to understand, but undeniable in their presence. The pastor stumbled back, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The whispering grew louder, converging into something that sounded almost like laughter. It echoed off the walls, mocking his intrusion. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Show yourself." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the creak of footsteps on the stairs behind him. Grayson spun around, the beam of his flashlight catching the silhouette of a tall figure descending into the basement. It was Dr. Dane, his expression calm and unbothered despite being caught. "Pastor Grayson," Dane said, his voice carrying an almost pleasant tone, "I didn't expect a visit from you tonight, and in such a clandestine manner." Grayson tightened his grip on the flashlight. "What is this place? What have you done to her?" He pointed the beam at Daisy's motionless body. Dane's eyes flicked to the table, then back to the pastor. "You've misunderstood, Pastor. Miss Miller is perfectly fine. She's simply resting." "Resting?" Grayson barked. "She looks dead." Dane chuckled softly, the sound unsettlingly smooth. "Dead is such a limiting term. I assure you, she is neither alive nor dead. At least, not in the way you think. She's in transition." "Transition?" Grayson's voice rose in disbelief. "What does that even mean?" "You're killing people, stealing them from their families." Dane stepped closer, his hands raised as if to calm the pastor. "I'm saving them, Pastor. Their lives were weighed down by suffering. by the chains of their mortal ailments. I've given them freedom, freedom from pain, from fear, from death itself. Grayson's flashlight wavered. You're playing God. This is evil. Dane's calm demeanor darkened slightly. Evil? Is it evil to save lives when no one else would? To give people a chance at something greater than the miserable existence they've known? You call it evil because you don't understand. I understand enough, Grayson spat. You're taking people against their will? And for what? To experiment on them? To feed your sick obsession? Dane tilted his head, his piercing blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. I think you misunderstand your role here, Pastor. You see yourself as a savior, a guardian of this town's morality. But you're just as flawed as the rest of them. You cling to your dogma, your fear of the unknown, while I offer a solution. You could join me, together. We could do so much more for this town. Grayson's heart pounded. I'd rather die than join you. Dane's expression didn't change, but the whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around the room like a tangible presence. The pastor felt a pressure on his chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. He stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam flickered as it rolled across the floor, casting jagged shadows. You should have left well enough alone, Dane said softly, his voice almost pitying. You could have lived your life in peace, but now you've seen too much. Grayson struggled to speak, but the pressure was overwhelming. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to claw at his mind. In the corner of his vision, he saw Daisy stir, her eyes snapping open, but they were not her eyes. They were dark, empty voids that seemed to pull at his very soul. He let out a strangled cry and ran, his instincts overriding his fear. He barreled up the stairs through the clinic and out into the cold night air. The whispers followed him, lingering in his ears even as he stumbled into the town square. The next morning, Pastor Grayson gathered the townsfolk in the church. His voice was frantic, his words disjointed as he tried to explain what he had seen. He's not a doctor, he told them. He's something else, something unnatural. He's taking our loved ones, and we need to stop him. But the people were hesitant. Many of them had been healed by Dr. Dane, and despite the disappearances, they were reluctant to turn against the man who had brought them relief. You have no proof, Mayor Briggs said. You're asking us to condemn the only doctor we've had in years based on fear and speculation. Grayson slammed his fist on the pulpit. I saw it with my own eyes. He's experimenting on them, turning them into something else. Do you want to wait until it's your child on his table? The crowd murmured uneasily, but few were willing to act. Grayson's pleas fell on deaf ears, and as the meeting dispersed, he felt a heavy weight of despair settle over him. He was alone in his fight, and he knew it. That night, as he sat in his study, he heard a soft knock at the door. Grayson tensed, reaching for the Bible on his desk as if it were a weapon. The knock came again, louder this time. He opened the door cautiously, and there stood Daisy Miller. Her pale face was illuminated by the glow of the moon, her dark eyes fixed on him. Pastor, she said, her voice hollow and mechanical. The doctor would like a word. Pastor Grayson stared at Daisy, his breath catching in his throat. Her appearance was unnerving. She looked like the girl he had once known, but there was something off about her. Her skin seemed waxy under the pale moonlight, and her dark eyes held none of the warmth or innocence they once had. They were voids, mirrors of something alien and malevolent. Daisy, Grayson whispered, clutching the doorframe for support. Is that really you? She tilted her head, the motion unnervingly slow. The doctor would like to see you, she repeated in the same hollow tone. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Grayson's instinct screamed at him to slam the door and pray for salvation. But the rational part of him knew that running would solve nothing. If Dr. Dane wanted him, there would be no hiding. He swallowed hard and nodded. All right, he said, his voice trembling. Take me to him. Daisy stepped back, her movements mechanical, as though she were being controlled by invisible strings. Grayson grabbed his coat and followed her into the frigid night. The streets of Clearwater were eerily quiet, the town asleep, blissfully unaware of the horrors lurking in their midst. As they approached the clinic, Grayson's heart pounded in his chest. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows blackened, and the faintest hint of that metallic smell wafted through the air. Daisy led him to the front door, which opened before she could knock, as if expecting their arrival. Dr. Dane stood in the doorway, his tall figure backlit by the dim light of the clinic. His face was as calm and unreadable as ever, but there was an air of triumph about him, as though he had already won whatever game they were playing. "Pastor Grayson," Dane greeted, his voice as smooth as silk. "Thank you for coming. I was hoping we could have a civil discussion." Grayson forced himself to stand tall, though his knees felt like they might give out at any moment. "What do you want from me?" Dane smiled faintly and gestured for him to come inside. "Only your understanding, Pastor. You've misjudged me, and I'd like to set the record straight." The clinic was as pristine as always, its sterile smell masking the sinister reality of what lay beneath. Dane led Grayson to the examination room and motioned for him to sit in one of the chairs. The pastor hesitated but complied, his eyes never leaving Dane's face. "You've seen more than most," Dane began, his tone conversational. "I imagine you have questions." Grayson clenched his fists. "I've seen enough to know you're not who you claim to be. You're taking people, turning them into things. Why? What are you doing to them?" Dana chuckled softly. "Straight to the point. I admire that. But your perspective is limited, Pastor. You see tragedy where there is salvation." "Salvation?" Grayson spat. "Is that what you call this? Experimenting on people, stealing them from their families?" "Experimenting," Dane echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not experimenting. I'm perfecting. You see, the human body is frail, flawed. Disease, injury, age, they reduce us to shadows of what we could be. My work eliminates those weaknesses. I don't take people. I elevate them." "Elevate them?" Grayson's voice rose, anger overpowering his fear. "They're gone. Molly, Walter, Daisy. They're not the same. You've stripped them of their humanity." Dane's eyes flashed with something cold and dangerous. "Humanity," he repeated, his voice sharp. "A fragile, fleeting concept. Do you think your humanity serves you well? It makes you weak, selfish, fearful. The people you speak of, Molly, Walter, Daisy, they're free from those burdens now. They are stronger, better, eternal." Grayson shook his head, his stomach churning. "You're delusional. Whatever you've done to them, it's not freedom. It's slavery to something. I don't know what, but it's not natural." Dane leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Grayson's. "Natural?" he said softly. "Do you think the universe is natural, Pastor? Do you think the divine order you preach about is some perfect, benevolent design? Chaos is the only constant. I've simply learned to harness it." The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder. Grayson's hands flew to his ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. The voices seemed to come from inside his own head, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow feared deeply. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice strained. Dana smiled. "Ah, you hear them? The voices of those who came before. They were like you once, skeptical, resistant. But they've come to see the truth." The whispers grew into a deafening roar, a chorus of voices overlapping in a maddening symphony. Grayson felt his vision blur, the room spinning around him. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the floor. Through the haze, he saw Daisy step forward, her dark eyes fixed on him. "You'll understand soon," she said, her voice still eerily hollow. "The doctor will help you see." "No," Grayson gasped, his strength fading. "I won't let you." The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Dr. Dane's calm, smiling face. Grayson awoke in a dimly lit room, his head pounding and his body feeling strangely heavy. He tried to move, but his limbs felt sluggish, as though they were weighed down by an invisible force. "You're awake," Dane's voice said from somewhere nearby. "Good. I was hoping we'd have more time to talk." Grayson turned his head slowly and saw Dane standing at the foot of the table he was strapped to. The doctor held a syringe filled with a dark, viscous liquid, its contents shimmering unnaturally under the flickering light. "You'll thank me for this one day," Dane said, his voice almost tender. It's time for you to let go of your fears, your limitations. You'll see the world as it truly is. Grayson struggled weakly, his voice a hoarse whisper. No, I won't. Dane's expression didn't waver. You will, Pastor. Everyone does in the end. The syringe descended, and Grayson felt the cold sting of the needle piercing his skin. The world dissolved into a swirl of light and shadow, and the last thing he heard was the whispers, louder than ever, enveloping him in their chilling embrace. Pastor Grayson's world had dissolved into darkness. Yet it wasn't a comforting, dreamless void. It was alive, pulsing with the whispers that had haunted him before. They were louder now, impossible to ignore, and they carried a strange cadence as if reciting a hymn in a language older than time itself. At first, he struggled to distinguish words, but slowly, they began to crystallize in his mind. The phrases were fragmented, nonsensical, but imbued with a sinister weight. The flesh is a prison. Eternity lies in the unraveling. He is the vessel. He didn't know how long he drifted in that state, minutes, hours, days. Time had no meaning in the void. Then, suddenly, he became aware of himself again. He felt his body, heavier than before, as if his bones had been replaced with lead. A faint light pierced the darkness, and he opened his eyes to find himself lying on a cold, metallic table. His vision swam as he took in his surroundings. He was no longer in the clinic. The room was cavernous, its walls carved from rough stone, illuminated by an otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Strange symbols covered the walls, etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. Grayson tried to sit up, but his arms were bound by thick leather straps. His muscles felt foreign to him, sluggish, unresponsive, as if they no longer belonged to him. "Ah, you're awake." The voice cut through the haze, and Grayson turned his head to see Dr. Dane standing nearby, his ever-present calm smile plastered across his face. He was holding an ancient-looking book, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with more of those cryptic symbols. "What have you done to me?" Grayson croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've given you a gift," Dane replied, his tone devoid of malice. "You're on the brink of understanding something far greater than yourself. You should feel honored." Grayson struggled against the straps, his panic growing. "You've poisoned me. Turned me into one of your puppets." Dane sighed, his smile fading slightly. "You still think so narrowly, Pastor. I don't take people's humanity, I elevate it. I've shown them the truth, freed them from the chains of their frail, dying bodies. Soon, you'll see it too. I don't want your truth." Grayson spat, his voice stronger now. "Whatever you're doing here, it's evil." Dane chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming in the eerie light. "Evil is a matter of perspective, Pastor. You preach about eternal life, salvation, yet when it's offered to you in a form you don't understand, you recoil. Typical of your kind." Grayson's heart raced. "What are you?" Dane paused, considering the question. "I am a seeker of knowledge, a servant of forces greater than this mortal world. My methods may seem harsh to you, but they are necessary. Change always requires sacrifice." Grayson's mind raced as he tried to piece together an escape. His limbs still felt like they were encased in lead, but he refused to give in. He focused on his surroundings, noting every detail. The symbols on the walls, the strange machinery that hummed faintly in the background, the dimly lit corridors leading away from the room. All of it felt wrong, as though he were no longer on Earth. "What do you want with me?" he demanded, stalling for time. Dane set the book down on a nearby table and stepped closer, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Grayson's. "You, Pastor, are special. Your resistance, your faith, it makes you an ideal vessel." "Vessel for what?" Grayson shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. Dane's smile widened. "For them." As he spoke, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Grayson felt a pressure building in his chest, as though the very atmosphere were pressing down on him. Then he saw them. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, twisting and writhing as if alive. Shapes emerged from the darkness, amorphous, shifting figures that defied logic. They had no clear form, no faces, but their presence was undeniable. Grayson felt their eyes, if they had eyes, boring into him, probing his mind, his soul. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real. It's more real than anything you've ever known," Dane said, his voice reverent. "These beings are beyond your comprehension, Pastor. They are the architects of existence, the weavers of fate. And you will be their vessel." Grayson thrashed against the straps, his terror giving him a surge of strength. "I won't let you do this. You can't take me." Dane's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice." He reached for a strange device on the table, a needle-like instrument connected to a series of tubes filled with glowing liquid. Grayson's panic reached a fever pitch as Dane brought the device closer to his arm. "Let this be your rebirth," Dane said softly, pressing the needle into Grayson's vein. The liquid burned as it entered his bloodstream, a searing pain that spread through his entire body. Grayson screamed, his vision blurring as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. He felt his mind being pulled apart, his thoughts unraveling like threads being plucked from a tapestry. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. Grayson gasped for air, his body trembling. He felt different, stronger, but not in a way he could explain. His senses were heightened. He could hear the faint hum of energy in the walls, see the minute cracks in the stone, feel the vibrations of the earth beneath him. But it wasn't just his physical senses. His mind was expanded. He could hear the whispers clearly now, understand their words. "They're inside me," he whispered, his voice filled with horror. Dane nodded, his expression almost fatherly. "Yes, they are. And soon, you will become one with them." Grayson stared at him, his terror replaced by a burning resolve. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let this happen." With a surge of strength he didn't know he possessed, he snapped the straps binding his arms and sat up. Dane's eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, Grayson lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The pastor grabbed the book from the table and ran, his newfound strength propelling him forward. The whispers screamed in his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing on one goal: escape. Grayson stumbled through the corridors, the symbols on the walls pulsing with a sickly light. The shadows seemed to follow him, reaching for him with unseen hands. He clutched the book tightly, its weight oddly comforting. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get out. The whispers grew louder, angrier, as if the beings within the shadows were enraged by his defiance. He could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. Then, up ahead, he saw it. A faint light, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. He ran toward it with everything he had, the book pressed against his chest. Pastor Grayson sprinted toward the faint light, his lungs burning and his heart pounding as if it might burst. The shadows clawed at him, tendrils of darkness lashing out, trying to drag him back into the abyss. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, no longer faint murmurs, but a cacophony of shrieks and commands. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the oppressive presence bearing down on him. The tunnel grew narrower, the walls rough and uneven, as if the earth itself had rebelled against the unnatural forces within. The light ahead flickered like a dying flame, but Grayson clung to it as his only hope. In his hands, the ancient book felt alive, pulsing faintly with an energy that both repelled and attracted the shadows around him. He stumbled into a cavern, the light illuminating its vast expanse. The room was unlike anything he had ever seen. A temple carved from the stone, its walls lined with towering pillars inscribed with the same glowing symbols. At the center stood a massive altar, its surface stained dark with what Grayson prayed wasn't blood. The light emanated from above, a swirling orb of green energy suspended in the air, pulsing rhythmically like a heart. As Grayson took in the horrific sight, a voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "You cannot escape, Pastor. You belong to us now." Dr. Dane emerged from the shadows, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. His hands were outstretched, his posture almost reverent as he approached the altar. "You've felt it, haven't you?" Dane said, his voice carrying both menace and conviction. "The power within you. The whispers are no longer a curse, but a gift. They've chosen you, Pastor. You are the vessel through which they will manifest." Grayson tightened his grip on the book, his breath ragged. "You've damned yourself, Dane, and you won't take me with you." Dane chuckled, the sound echoing eerily in the cavern. "You still cling to your outdated notions of good and evil, heaven and hell. This is beyond such petty concepts. This is transcendence." Grayson's gaze shifted to the orb above the altar. It pulsed faster as Dane approached, its energy crackling in the air. The whispers grew louder in his mind, urging him to submit, to join the unholy chorus. But something deeper, something untouched by the darkness, stirred within him, a defiance born of faith and sheer willpower. He remembered the people of Clearwater, the innocent lives stolen by Dane's twisted experiments. He couldn't let their fates be in vain. "You think this is freedom?" Grayson shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This thing you worship, it doesn't bring salvation. It consumes. It destroys." Dane stopped at the altar, turning to face Grayson with a faint smile. "Destruction is the price of creation. You, of all people, should understand that. After all, isn't that the foundation of your faith? The death of the old to bring forth the new. You're no savior," Grayson said through gritted teeth. "You're a servant of something that has no place in this world." Dane raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of mild amusement. "And you think you can stop it? You're already marked, Pastor. The whispers will never leave you. They're in your mind, your soul. Even now, they guide you." Grayson felt the truth in Dane's words, but he refused to give in. He glanced down at the book in his hands, its strange symbols glowing faintly. Something about it felt important, as if it held the key to defeating the horrors around him. As Dane stepped closer, Grayson opened the book, his eyes scanning its pages. The symbols shifted and writhed, making no sense, but then something clicked. His mind, altered by the injection of the strange substance, began to decode the ancient text. It was a spell, a ritual, meant to sever the connection between this world and the entities Dane served. Dane noticed what he was doing, and his calm demeanor cracked. "You don't know what you're meddling with," he said sharply. "That book is beyond your comprehension." Grayson ignored him, his voice trembling as he began to recite the words aloud. The language felt unnatural on his tongue, each syllable scraping against his mind like shards of glass. The whispers grew frenzied, their anger palpable, but he pressed on. "No!" Dane roared, lunging toward him. "You'll ruin everything." Grayson stepped back, holding the book like a shield. "If I can stop this madness, it'll be worth it." The cavern trembled as the orb above the altar began to destabilize. Its once steady pulse became erratic, and tendrils of energy lashed out, striking the walls and causing chunks of stone to fall. The shadows writhed violently, their shapes distorting as if in pain. Dane reached for Grayson, his expression wild with desperation. "You don't understand. They'll consume you too. There's no escape from them." Grayson dodged, continuing to chant the incantation. His voice grew stronger as the words became clearer in his mind, the alien language somehow becoming second nature. The orb let out a deafening shriek, and for a moment, Grayson thought his skull might split open. With one final word, he closed the book and hurled it toward the altar. The tome burst into flames as it struck the stone, and the orb erupted in a blinding explosion of green light. The force knocked Grayson off his feet, and he hit the ground hard, the world spinning around him. When he opened his eyes, the cavern was silent. The orb was gone, and the oppressive energy that had filled the air had dissipated. The symbols on the walls had dimmed, their glow extinguished. Dane lay motionless near the altar, his body crumpled like a discarded marionette. Grayson pushed himself to his feet, his limbs trembling. He looked down at Dane, half expecting him to rise, but the man's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, lifeless. "It's over," Grayson whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. He turned and made his way back through the tunnels, his steps unsteady but determined. The whispers were gone, leaving a hollow silence in their place. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, his mind was his own. Grayson emerged into the night air, the stars above shining brighter than he had ever seen them. Clearwater lay before him, quiet and undisturbed, as if the nightmare had never happened. But he knew better. The scars of what had transpired would remain with him forever. As he made his way back to town, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The darkness hadn't left entirely. It lingered at the edges of his mind, a shadow of what it had once been. And he knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. The journey back to Clearwater felt endless. Pastor Grayson trudged through the woods, his every step echoing in the oppressive silence of the night. Though the whispers were gone, a new weight pressed on him, a nagging sense of incompleteness, as though the darkness he'd fought had left something behind. His body felt heavier, his senses heightened, and his mind struggled to reconcile the events that had unfolded in the depths beneath Dr. Dane's clinic. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, dawn was breaking. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the quiet streets, the sight eerily normal compared to the horrors he had just escaped. Houses stood undisturbed, their windows reflecting the soft light of morning. Yet Grayson knew that Clearwater was far from safe. The darkness may have been driven back, but its roots ran deep. Grayson made his way to the church, his sanctuary in a world turned upside down. The familiar creak of the old wooden door greeted him as he stepped inside. The pews were empty, the altar untouched, but the air carried a strange heaviness, as if the building itself was mourning the events that had unfolded. He sank to his knees before the altar, gripping its edge tightly. "God," he whispered, his voice trembling, "if you're still here, if you're still listening, give me strength." His prayer hung in the air, unanswered, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. As the sun rose higher, the townsfolk began to stir. They emerged from their homes, going about their routines, blissfully unaware of the horrors that had nearly consumed their lives. Grayson knew he had to warn them, but how could he explain what had happened? How could he make them believe that their savior, Dr. Dane, had been a monster? And worse, how could he convince them that the darkness wasn't gone, that it had merely retreated, waiting for another chance? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He turned to see Sheriff Calvin Walker, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "Pastor," the sheriff said, his voice cautious, "you've been missing all night. Folks are starting to ask questions." Grayson rose to his feet, his body aching from the ordeal. "Calvin, we need to talk. There's something terrible that's been happening in this town." The sheriff frowned, stepping closer. "If this is about Dr. Dane, I've been hearing some things. People are saying he's gone, that his clinic's empty. Do you know where he is?" Grayson hesitated. How could he explain what had happened without sounding insane? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak. "Dane is dead," he said finally. "In his clinic, it was a gateway to something beyond our understanding. Something evil." Walker's eyes narrowed. "Evil? Pastor, you're not making sense. What happened to him? What did you do?" "I stopped him," Grayson said, his voice firm. "But it's not over. The darkness he brought here, it's still out there. Watching, waiting." The sheriff's expression softened, a mix of confusion and pity. "You've been through hell, that's clear. But people need answers, Pastor. They're scared. And if you're right about this darkness, we need to know how to fight it." Grayson nodded slowly. "I'll tell you everything. But first, we need to make sure the clinic is destroyed. Burn it to the ground if we have to. We can't let whatever's left there take root." That afternoon, Grayson and Walker led a group of townsfolk to the clinic. The building stood silent and foreboding, its once pristine exterior now seeming cold and lifeless. The townspeople whispered among themselves, their unease palpable. Grayson stood before them, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "This place is a scar on our town. It brought us false hope, and it nearly destroyed us. We can't let it remain." With that, the group set to work. They tore down the walls, smashed the equipment, and piled the debris in the street. When the sun began to set, they lit the pile aflame, the fire consuming the remnants of Dr. Dane's twisted legacy. As the flames roared, Grayson felt a momentary sense of relief. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The darkness had been banished from the clinic, but its roots ran deeper than he could reach. He could still feel its lingering presence, a shadow at the edge of his mind. Later that night, as the town settled into an uneasy calm, Grayson returned to the church. He sat in the front pew, staring at the altar, his mind heavy with doubt. The book he had taken from the cavern was gone, consumed in the fire along with the clinic. But its words still lingered in his mind, etched into his thoughts like scars. You can't escape them. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Grayson turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty church. There was no one there, but the words hung in the air like a ghost. In the days that followed, life in Clearwater returned to a fragile normalcy. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about Dr. Dane and the strange events surrounding his disappearance, but no one pressed for details. Grayson continued to lead his congregation, though his sermons carried a new weight, a warning of unseen evils, of vigilance against the shadows. But Grayson knew that vigilance wouldn't be enough. One night, as he sat alone in his study, he felt the darkness stir within him again. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, tugging at the edges of his mind. He stared at his reflection in the window, and for a moment, he saw something that wasn't his own, a flicker of black eyes, empty and endless. The shadows weren't gone. They had merely found a new vessel. Months later, a traveler passing through Clearwater asked about the town's strange history. The locals spoke of the doctor who had come and gone, of the fire that had destroyed his clinic. But they also spoke of their pastor, a man changed by the ordeal, his sermons darker, his eyes carrying a weight no one could understand. And late at night, when the town was quiet, some claimed to hear faint whispers on the wind, calling out from the darkness. Whispers that never truly left. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.